J.D. Vance at that TPUSA event in Georgia yesterday, taking questions on a range of topics, as you would expect, including on the rhetorical contretemps between the president and the pontiff. J.D. Vance saying, look, I don't mind if the Pope opines on things. It starts a conversation, but...
One, when the Pope says that God is never on the side of those who wield the sword, there is more than 1,000-year tradition of just war theory. Okay? Now, we can, of course, have disagreements about whether this or that conflict is just, but I think that it's important, in the same way that it's important for the Vice President of the United States to be careful when I talk about matters of public policy, I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology.
Indeed.
I think one of the issues here is that if you're going to opine on matters of theology, you've got to be careful. You've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth. And that's one of the things that I try to do. And it's certainly something I would expect from the clergy, whether they're Catholic or Protestant. Now.
And, you know, he also, just to advance this idea of just war theory, provided, I thought, a useful example of what he means, put it in another context.
Even when there's disagreement, I like it when the Pope comments on questions of immigration. I like it when the Pope talks about abortion. I like it when the Pope talks about matters of war and peace, because I think that at the very least it invites a conversation. So I think some people, you know, their reaction to this is to say, well, you know, he shouldn't have said that. And look, there are certainly things that the Pope has said in the last few months that I disagree with. Let me just take like one very concrete example, you know, related to this conflict in Iran. So the Pope said something where he said, and I'm going to try to remember the exact quote, but he said that God is never on the side of those who wield the sword. God is never on the side of those who wield the sword. I'm pretty sure that he said that exact statement. Now, on the one hand, again, I like that the Pope is an advocate for peace. I think that's certainly one of his roles. On the other hand, how can you say that God is never on the side of those who wield the sword? Was God on the side of the Americans who liberated France from the Nazis? Was God on the side of the Americans who liberated Holocaust camps and liberated those innocent people from, you know, those who had survived the Holocaust? I certainly think the answer is yes.
I would agree. I would agree with him. The Pope doesn't need to, quote, stay in his lane. You can offer, and encourage you to offer, as a Catholic, a theological perspective on salient worldly issues. It doesn't bother me. It bothers me when you're not precise, as J.D. Vance was saying, or incorrect when you wade out of the faith and into public policy. But yeah, it certainly sparks a debate. I mean, again, when we talked about this yesterday, I mentioned I appreciated as a young man Pope, now St. John Paul II's theological and intellectual leadership during the Cold War as an ally of Western civilization and an opponent of totalitarianism. And, you know, that's where I would like the leaders of my faith to be, proponents of free minds and free markets and individual liberty, Western civilization, and opponents of repression wherever it may rear its ugly head, including in Iran, for example. For more on this topic and others, including the ouster of Viktor Orban in Hungary, which we've talked about a bit, Richard Reinsch joins us. He's the editor-in-chief of Civitas Outlook. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for having me on.
You know, what's your perspective on sort of the Pope as a and religious leaders of other faith traditions too, as both theologians, but as well as public policy influencers, for lack of a better description?
A couple of things. I've at different points of my career had the opportunity to study in depth just war theory. And you can't understand just war theory without Roman Catholic theologians and those who are considered to be intellectual leaders of the Catholic tradition, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, the scholastics, Jesuit thinkers as well, and as we move into the early modern era. So I think when I heard, and I say this as a faithful Roman Catholic, when I heard Pope Leo XIV say that God is never on the side of the warrior and dismiss out of hand the possibility that what America is doing against Iran couldn't be a just war, that made me scratch my head.
Yeah.
I also will say, as a faithful Roman Catholic, the Pope and the bishops in America can speak on any issue they want, but they should also do so, I would argue, in the light of what does Catholicism actually have to contribute to this question. And on the idea of war, just war theory says the decision is in the hands of those who have care for the common good. That would be the President of the United States and the United States Congress, to the extent the Congress wants to get involved in this question. It's not, I think, unless it's just blatantly obvious, I would argue the Pope weighing in is not as helpful as it could be. There is also a tradition of recent popes, including John Paul II, of not really running through the analysis of just war theory, which is about, is it just? Who made the decision? What measures are being taken? Are they not, are they avoiding attacking the innocent and civilians? Is there a possibility of bringing this war to an end? What's the resolution? Those are all the sorts of practical wisdom, prudential questions that just war theory emphasizes, precisely to cabin what war can do, and that war also inherently activates, even if you're fighting a just war, the worst parts of human nature. And so you're trying to cabin that and steer it towards a good end. So, my sense with Pope Leo is he's an American, and there are parts of Trump that drive him crazy, and he's speaking about Donald Trump in a way most popes wouldn't. So, Pope Leo criticized, made fun of Truth Social on the papal plane yesterday. I would submit he did that because he's an American. And he decided to act like an American, who we're always talking about Donald Trump. How could you not? And so I think, as I listen to the vice president's comments, they're better. They're much better than what I think Donald Trump said about the Pope. And they're better than what J.D. Vance recently said about the Pope, where he said he just shouldn't speak on these issues. Now, it's also sort of weird having the vice president tell the Pope he doesn't understand his own tradition. You got to be careful there as well. But I think
but you're right. But I mean,
Vance's comments. What I think, I'll just say real quickly, what I think Vance's comments do is they put the pressure back on the Pope to come to terms with what the Catholic Church actually teaches about war, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, no, that's where I was going too. It's challenging his understanding of his own tradition. Well, when he says something like he said that, as you said, had you scratching your head. I mean, I think it's fine for a Catholic or, frankly, anybody else to challenge his own understanding of his thinking, right? I mean, he got just war theory wrong, when, at least with that sort of imprecise comment about God is never on the side of the warrior. I mean, that's just that. And the example J.D. Vance gave from World War II is on the mark.
Yeah. No, and I think now clearly Donald Trump, even for those of us who support the war, I wish that Trump had been clear from the beginning about the purposes and objectives. I wish he had made more of a public case before we went in. But to argue that taking away nuclear weapons from what is essentially a regime of terror and apocalyptic mindedness about theology and how they might use those weapons, which they have said for years they want to use them against us, and they want to use them against their allies. To say that can't be a just war, just a priori, is ridiculous.
Yeah. I'm just glad that Trump stopped short of calling for regime change at the Vatican. He wants Louis Prevost to be the Pope.
That would have been way too much. Yeah, way too much. And I'll say this too: Trump positioning himself as Christ on social media and all that stuff.
Yeah,
if that seems to me to rise to the level of blasphemy, if not disrespect.
Yes,
they shouldn't do those things.
Yes. The other problem, though, too, just because this is not just Iran, there are other issues too, and one was brought up. J.D. Vance brought up immigration. I mean, the other thing, it's a bad look. It's a bad look for the Pope and for the Vatican. I mean, I've been to Vatican City, pretty fortified. So it's a bad look for the Pope and for cardinals, including Chicago's very own Supich, to be lecturing the administration and by extension the country and the Western world in the direction of sort of the pithy "no person is illegal" kind of leftist mantra, refrigerator magnet aphorisms, and dumb ones at that. To be lecturing people in that direction when, as I said, Vatican City is quite fortified. So, the plank in your eye is a bad look for the papacy.
Well, no, and we can say something similar about this immigration debate. Look, I again, as a faithful Roman Catholic, I have disagreed with the prudential conclusion that American Catholic bishops came to on immigration, and it's a position they've had for decades, that somehow we should have an open border or we should have a very loosely regulated immigration system, and this is inherently for the good of the country. And you have Catholic charities, which are largely now run, and I don't know if that's still true, but it has been true, they're run through federal government funding, and they're sort of making all of this immigration possible. But what does the Catholic Church actually teach about immigration? Nations have to make decisions based on who they can bring in. You bring in people who are maybe suffering, who are close to you, you help them out. And ultimately, it's a question of what can you absorb and what's good for your country. And that's, broadly speaking, the Catholic Church position. That is not a blanket justification for anyone in the world who wants to come to America or Europe gets to go. And that's kind of their position. And so this ridiculous CBS interview with Cardinal Supich, Cardinal McElroy of Washington, D.C., and Cardinal Tobin, all of whom are very left-wing, were appointed by Pope Francis, not just for their left-wing politics, but to liberalize the church's teaching and doctrine. It's sort of silly, and it's kind of dumb when you think about what's happening right now in the Catholic Church in America is a lot of young people are converting and joining and want to be a part of it. That was not supposed to be the case. And why not talk about that and emphasize that rather than get into this very partisan, one-sided war that a lot of the people in your churches don't agree with you on, and don't understand the sort of moralizing, hectoring tone on something that's not essential to church doctrine, practice, and being Roman Catholic.
Yeah. Something else, J.D. Vance, of course, prior to heading off to Pakistan for negotiations with the Iranians last weekend, was in Budapest in advance of this weekend's election in Hungary, which Viktor Orban lost, ending a reign of decade and a half. And Vance had this to say about Orban's loss, did this reflect poorly on the Trump administration and so forth?
I think that Viktor Orban's a great guy who's done a very good job. I think that his legacy in Hungary is transformational, 16 years fundamentally changing that country. But one of the reasons why we decided to do that, Brett, is not because, we can't read polls. We certainly knew there was a very good chance that Viktor would lose that election. We did it because he's one of the few European leaders we've seen who's been willing to stand up to the bureaucracy in Brussels that has been very, very bad for the United States. So, for example, when you see a European bureaucrat go after an American company, sometimes the only vote no, the only vote to protect that American interest has been Viktor Orban. We didn't go because we expected Viktor to cruise to an election victory. We went because it was the right thing to do, to stand behind a person who had stood by us for a very long time. So this wasn't about Russia, and fundamentally it wasn't about Europe. It was about the United States and the fact that he's been a good partner to both me and the president personally, but also to the United States. I'm sad that he lost. We'll work very well, I'm sure, with the next prime minister of Hungary. But it wasn't a bad trip at all, because it's worth standing by people, even if you don't win every race.
I don't have the same affinity for Viktor Orban that Trump and Vance do, and even Rod Dreher, who I have great admiration for. But I also don't think some of the criticisms of Orban as some sort of Putin-esque autocrat stooge are accurate. What's your view on that and on Orban and the implication? Is this something, this maybe discussion or debate between conservatives about Orban and who he was and what his legacy is? Is this something that has that is forward-looking in terms of how we assess foreign leaders?
So I think I have kind of what I think is a balanced take on Orban. I've written pieces on Orban that he had more democratic legitimacy, I think, than his European Union opponents. This is a man who had won multiple elections in Hungary. The Constitution, he's blamed for changing the Constitution, which moved in a more religious Christian direction in terms of some of its principles, you might say, and yet the Constitution Hungary had at that time was essentially the communist Constitution it had when it was under the Constitution that it was given right when it transitioned out of being in the Eastern Bloc. And the people wanted to change it and move it more in their direction, and he helped with that. I think he also made the right decision in keeping out the migrants in 2015. Hungary is a very safe place if you're Jewish. That cannot be said in many countries and capitals in Europe. But I also think there's a question about corruption. There's a question about people, if you are close to him, being put in charge of major companies. There's a question of economic stagnation, of your most talented people leaving your country and going elsewhere, viewing Hungary as kind of a dead end if you're high human capital. And I think there's also this sort of, we might call quote unquote new right network of thinking that he was involved in very extensive interventions in the economy, and also this idea of we'll increase our birth rate by spending large amounts of money on families and paying people to have more children. And none of those policies, I've read a lot, really seem to move the needle in the direction that we were told, and including Hungary's birth rate, which is lower than America's and is lower than many other countries in Europe who don't have nearly as the extensive payment structure that Hungary put into place. I think J.D. Vance, the question too, who is Orban's opponent in this election? This is actually, Peter Magyar is actually center-right. He's a conservative, and major, people were not supporting him necessarily for those reasons. They were supporting him and helped him win an overwhelming victory in electoral districts, many of which have been gerrymandered by Orban's party, precisely because of this corruption issue, an issue of insider or cronyism type stuff that people perceive and what's happening in the government. Peter Magyar is going to be a friend of the United States of America in the European Union. I don't think that's in doubt. I think really the big rub is Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
And Vance very much opposes any support to Ukraine. He said this is like the crowning thing he's worked on as a vice president, to curtail funding to Ukraine. And Magyar does not agree with that position and sees Putin and Russia as a bad regime that should not have invaded Ukraine, and that bothers J.D. Vance. I do not think Magyar is going to let in lots of migrants into Hungary or anything along those lines. And I think he's actually going to he will pursue policies that most conservatives in America would agree with. So why this became sort of a ground zero contest for J.D. Vance to go over there and intervene when it looked like Orban was going to lose and America has to work with the next government doesn't make a lot of sense. Magyar, to his credit, has said, I can't wait to work with the Trump administration. Donald Trump today has said he looks like a great guy we can work with, so it doesn't seem to have cost anything. There's also this question of the network of conservatives in America who have gone over there to be a part of this extensive think tank network, publicly funded, that Orban put into place. And these people are all very close to J.D. Vance. A lot of them are Americans. You mentioned one, Rod Dreher. There are others, Gladden Pappin, Adrian Vermeule, others who have received funding or opportunities there. And that all sort of comes to an end. But they were looking to Hungary as a place where their different ideas about the state and the economy and the family and religion were coming together. And that's why they were so invested in Orban.
Yeah.
And that is over. That is over. And Vance is inherently a part of this network. He owes his rise and many of his ideas to these people. So it's much more complicated than that comment he made.
Richard Reinsch, editor-in-chief of Civitas Outlook, thanks so much for joining us again. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
And he joined us on the alphawealthgroup.com answer line. Thank you for joining us this morning on another edition of Chicago's Morning Answer. It is now 9 o'clock on AM 560 WIND Chicago.
We're in the second and final week